and lawmakers preparing to debate and vote on that measure that would address the scope of President Trump's ongoing military operations in Iran. Joining us now to assess is retired U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel Robert McGinnis and Senior Fellow for National Security at the Family Research Council, John Sitilides, former diplomacy consultant for the State Department, and John Burns, Strategic Director for Concerned Veterans for America. Great to have everybody back with us. John Sitilides, we'll start with you. If the vote does pass, how would it affect ongoing operations and the trajectory of the conflict?
Well, the if is the important part of your question here, Steve. I don't think it's going to pass. I think it's healthy in a democratic society, small d, to have these types of debates. But I think given the nature of this particular operation, it's not something that's going to advance with any significant amount of votes, certainly not in the Republican Party, probably in the Democratic Party, more as a signal of opposition to Trump policies. And there's a larger constitutional question. This issue has been debated ever since the War Powers Act was enacted in the early 1970s. And there are many who believe that Congress needs to be involved in every decision involving every major military operation. And others will argue that the president needs maximum freedom to be able to execute American foreign policy and military strategy. We'll see how this plays out, but I doubt very much this is going to get any traction to speak of in the days and weeks ahead.
Colonel, to John's point, enacted in the 1970s, we've had multiple wars since then, so none ever making its way through Congress. So what options would the president have to continue on if he needed to? And from a military standpoint, how disruptive might it be should congressional restrictions be placed in the middle of an active campaign?
Well, it's like trying to stop the government by defunding it or not allowing it to go forward. The military is already, forward stationed in 8 countries, 19 facilities, and a major flotilla in the Med as well as in the Persian Gulf and in the Indian Ocean. So we have a lot of people over there. You just don't turn them on a dime and bring them back. So, it's ludicrous to suggest from the opposition's perspective that we're going to turn this off easily. So, we'll continue the operation. I don't think with, the majority that's still on the Republican side in the Senate and the House that you're going to see a lot of traction that's given to the opposition, especially when you have an Article 2 decision to really put us in danger and troops are well forward being killed. Obviously, we've lost 6 regrettably already. So I don't think that the timeline is going to work on their side. The president indicates this is probably only going to last 4 to 5 weeks. I don't expect it to be extended. I think they're going to keep it in the air as much as possible. I do not anticipate boots on the ground, but if that happens, Katie bar the door, we'll have to reevaluate.
John Burns, as the Colonel pointed out, we've already lost 6 American service members to this very young conflict. We're in an age right now that's somewhat unprecedented for a conflict of this size. Air power buildup like we haven't seen since the early 2000s during Operation Iraqi Freedom. A lot has happened and changed in our country. Social media has developed to a point that it was not at that point with disinformation. The partisanship in the politics, you have the midterms coming up. What message would this send to our U.S. service members who are currently deployed in the region should something get passed? And what do you make of the current state of politics at play?
Well, I'm with the other 2 gentlemen. This thing doesn't stand a snowball's chance in Saudi Arabia passing. There's just not the will to do this. And I think that's a big part of the problem. Myself, Concerned Veterans for America, we would have preferred to see a vote on this ahead of time, just looking at the size of the operation, the scope of the operation. Would have loved to see the president lay out a better case early for this, and some of his rationales come out piecemeal. But Congress has given up its willingness to do that job. It is a constitutional role that Congress has, but they have eschewed it for years and years. And little by little, with salami tactics, cutting off a slice at a time, every executive has taken a piece of this war making, this military deployment power, into Article 2, into the executive branch. And this Congress, as you pointed out, politics have changed, that social and cultural makeup of the country has changed. And Congress is no longer willing to do the business of legislating, whether it's around war powers in the military or around lots and lots of regulations that they export to bureaucratic agencies instead of making laws. So there is a real problem with the way Congress operates.
John Sitilides, we're getting breaking news right now. Reports of the U.S. Embassy in Saudi Arabia, in the capital there, Riyadh, being struck by 2 drones. If this is indeed the case, how big of an escalation is this in this very active war?
It's, of course, very concerning, but it shouldn't come as a surprise. First of all, we've seen Iranian sleeper cells and fellow Shia in Pakistan attack the U.S. consulate in Karachi over the weekend. There were major attacks, efforts to penetrate the Iraqi embassy in Baghdad, or the U.S. embassy in Iraq in Baghdad over the weekend. And I think the Trump administration is expecting these kinds of attacks. Look, they've been attacking American bases throughout the Middle East. They've been attacking jewel properties of Gulf Arab countries. I believe it's 7 or 8 countries that Iran has retaliated against for the U.S. and U.S. and Israeli strikes against Iran on Saturday and since then. So there are going to be these kinds of attacks. I think the Saudis are depending on the United States to work together to defend their facilities, whether it's the U.S. embassy, that's sovereign territory that the Saudi government has every obligation to defend, as does every country, the embassy of every other country on its territory, but also to work to ensure that the oil refineries are safe, that petrochemicals, oil and gas are getting out of the Persian Gulf to the extent possible. And the larger concern is to the extent to which the Strait of Hormuz, even though it's not de jure closed, it's de facto closed. There are 1,200 tankers that are anchored throughout the Strait of Hormuz, and the major global insurance companies won't cover them for war risk anymore. So we could see very significant short-term disruption in oil and LNG out of the Persian Gulf. But I think you'll see many more desperate attacks by the Iranian regime against these types of targets, whether it's the U.S. embassies in the region, U.S. bases, or major properties and assets of its Gulf Arab neighbors.
Colonel, I want to get your thoughts. U.S. Embassy struck by drones in Saudi Arabia. What does this tell you about Iran's ability to target the United States, in the region?
Well, I'd be more concerned about sleeper cells here in the United States proper, but in the region, clearly we're a big target. We have the Fifth Fleet. We have bases in Kuwait. We have a lot of people in Saudi. And all it takes is somebody with a couple of drones literally in their backpack, launch them at a particular target and then disappear. So it's like a terrorist attack with a suicide bomber. They can walk into a crowded room and kill a lot of people. The same sort of thing is going to continue. We've had these threats in the Middle East for decades and decades. You go back to '83 when they bombed the barracks there in Lebanon and killed 300 Marines. A lot of blood on the hands of the Iranians. We've had some experience. I think we're going to be very sensitive about the target-rich environment that a suicide bomber or somebody with a little drone in their backpack might use against us. So it's to be predicted.
John Burns?
Well, I think this is part of the reason we saw the Secretary of State earlier issue a warning for all Americans to leave the Mideast from Libya all the way to Iraq. I agree. The threat here is it's there. We saw that one of the remaining imams, 2 of the remaining imams, ordered a fatwa against the United States there. I think you've got a kind of a fail-safe situation where groups, proxies that had been held back and told to wait for instructions from the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps are now free to act as they will. So I think we're going to continue to see small outbreaks of terrorism. I served in the Army National Guard during the outbreak of the Iraq War, and we were placed in New York City subways and train stations. I think we're going to see more of that. I would be watching a state National Guard offices and their press releases. I know New Hampshire has stood up their state National Guard for this, but I think it's a very clear threat both here at home and overseas.
And John Sitilides, as you mentioned yesterday, the American embassy in Pakistan attacked by pro-Iran rioters. How do we ultimately protect American citizens and entities abroad from attacks by Iranian sympathizers and agents at this point?
Much of this depends on intelligence cooperation with the host countries. Obviously, we need to have a very robust military presence around American assets, whether it's embassies, major corporations, and obviously the many bases that we have in the Middle East and around the world. But in the Middle East, we have 35 to 40,000 American servicemen and women. I believe they're very well defended, but right now we're in a very kinetic theater of military operations. So it is very high risk. There's no doubt about it. And the president's been very honest. This is a dangerous situation, but much of this depends on the best intelligence cooperation with countries and partners like Israel, like Saudi Arabia, like UAE. Iraq might be a little bit sketchy because there are such pronounced Iranian influences in the Shia majority government in Baghdad. But I think we're doing the best that we can in a very difficult situation. And I pray, as we all have stated out earlier in this interview, that this hopefully will be weeks. But the problem, I would say, Steve, is that Iran has agency here also. And the president may say this is going to be 3 to 4 weeks, but the Iranians may be looking to absorb as many hits as possible in the beginning, have the U.S. and Israel expend as many of their munitions as possible, and then come back with massive waves, whether it's later in March, April, May. So ideally, we take out everything we need to in Iran, and we've got mission accomplished. But we're in fog of war. This could go on for days, weeks, and months, and time will tell. But we pray the best for our servicemen and women and for their military and civilian leaders.
And at that, we do have to leave it there. Robert McGinnis, John Sitilides, John Burns, thank you all for joining.